Good afternoon, folks. For those who don't know me, my name is Alexis Alvarez, and I'm the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services. I'm very excited to invite you here to talk about being a networking advocate. This training will take a comprehensive look on your personal brand development and your strategic networking, which, most of us in this audience, being part of legal aid or in the public interest world, don't think about on a regular basis. As you all know, this is the second part of a larger training series that we are calling Leaving a Legal Legacy. And the purpose of this training series as a whole is to have us as public interest lawyers and legal aid lawyers looking at ourselves as people in a field of business and how our entrepreneurial aspirations can assist us as legal aid lawyers and public interest lawyers. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. And thank you for thinking out of the box about what you can do every single day as a legal aid lawyer here in Florida. Before we move into introductions and then into our content, I do want to mention that this is being co-sponsored by the Public Interest Law section of the Florida Bar. For those of you who are not familiar with the section, it's a really great group of individuals who serve various different aspects of public service and come together to form one collective group of networking, of just people to be around with the same passions. So if you're not already part of PILS, please consider joining. I'm going to drop a link in the chat. That way, you can check it out a little bit more. And so housekeeping, this is being recorded. A copy of the recording will be sent to all of you who are here and those who registered. As I mentioned in our previous emails, the Florida Bar did not award this part of our training series with CLE credit. However, the other parts of our training series are receiving CLE credit. So either way, you're going to get CLE credit, and I appreciate you all being here on the journey with us. So today, we have the pleasure of learning from Richard Schwamm, who, if anyone remembers from our trial skills technology training that we had back in February, I believe, of 2023, was one of our best speakers, absolutely. And we are lucky enough to have Richard come back and now teach us about networking. A little bit about Richard. Richard has been a trial lawyer for more than 30 years and is senior partner at Haliczer, Pettis, and Schwamm. Richard mainly focuses his practice on the areas of medical malpractice, wrongful death, and catastrophic injury cases. Richard routinely lectures on medical malpractice litigation, advanced trial strategies, and the use of advanced technology during litigation and in the courtroom. Richard has been an invited guest speaker for numerous local bar associations throughout the state of Florida and nationally recognized institutions, including Harvard University, University of Central Florida, Medical Intelligence Corporation, and the Contemporary Forum Series. Richard earned the Martindale-Hubbell's AV rating for his high professional and ethical standards. Of note, he has been inducted as a Fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers, an honor bestowed on less than 1% of trial lawyers in the United States. He has also been frequently listed with Super Lawyers, Florida Trend, and the Orlando Family Magazine for his skill and expertise as a trial lawyer, particularly in the area of medical malpractice and litigation. Richard lives in Winter Garden, Florida, with his wife and his 2 children. Thank you, Richard, just for always being a friend of legal aid and always being a friend of public service, giving us your time and your expertise. We appreciate you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. And I will share my screen and get started because we have a lot to cover today.
And while you do that, I will mention, folks, please drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A. I am going to be presenting your questions to Richard as we go throughout the presentation. So drop them in. I'll make sure they're asked out loud. Don't be shy.
Thank you. I assume everybody can see my screen. And
Right.
without further ado, let's dive in. So first, I'm humbled to be asked to join you today, and I appreciate the fact that you provide such valuable content and education opportunities to all members of the Florida Bar, and especially now with the sponsorship of the Public Interest Law section. It is indeed a pleasure to talk to all of you about a subject that's near and dear to my heart. So the title of this talk is Strategic Networking and Relationship Building 101. So it's really an effort kind of at a beginner intermediate level to talk to you candidly about why relationship building is such a critical part of being a lawyer. A little bit more about me, so you kind of have some context as to where this conversation is coming from. And then we're going to cover a lot of subjects. Please feel free to interrupt me as we go along. I told Alexis that if you've got questions, stop me. Let's talk about them while we're on the topic, and we'll get back on task, and we'll cover everything within the hour we have available. So I've been a lawyer now for more than 30 years. I used to be a defense lawyer. I worked for a firm down in Palm Beach defending hospitals and doctors in medical malpractice cases, then got an opportunity to open up our firm's Orlando office. Another firm got recruited back in 1996 and opened up this office. And I've been here now for, we just celebrated last week to 28 years together as partners. We now don't do defense work anymore. We're only plaintiff's lawyers. So about 17 years ago, we started doing both sides, plaintiff and defense. And then 7 years ago, we made the jump and became plaintiff's lawyers. And we are what's called a low volume, high value practice. We don't have a lot of cases, but the cases we have typically involve significant damages. So we've got 7 lawyers now. We employ 3 nurses. I've got an in-house director of marketing, an in-house office administrator, and feel very blessed to have such great support to both do the work on the cases and do the job of also building business, building relationships. About me personally, grew up mostly down in South Florida. Most people don't know, I grew up with a real bad speech impediment, had a horrible lisp and a horrible stutter. If you had known me when I was in elementary school and middle school, you have known me as a very shy kid that could not speak in front of others. And when I did, as you know, with people with speech impediment, it's very difficult to have a conversation. Went through 8 years of speech therapy, never fixed the problem. And then when I got done, I was done. And I taught myself how to slow down, how to get rid of that lisp, how to get rid of that stutter. And then in high school, became interested in the law. Actually took a class called street law. There were some students at Nova Law School that were involved in helping to teach it. Got involved in my first mock trial. My job was to cross-examine witnesses. And during the finals of that competition, as I was cross-examining the witness who was a student playing a part, she made a mistake. I went after her like a shark, going after its bait, made her cry on the stand, turned around and said, "I'm hooked. I can make people cry for a living and get paid for it." So that was the story about how I got started. And we then kind of were reborn a bit about 7 years ago when we wanted to delve deeper into plaintiff's work. I had to learn how to not just work on files and work for big insurance companies. I had to work on building business. I had to better understand why building relationships was now going to be one of my priorities in life. And what I realized, and what you might be realizing as members of the kind of the public interest sector or the legal aid environment, is you don't have as much need as lawyers in the private sector do to really go out and generate business. At least I'm assuming that that has not historically been your priority, but you're probably looking at your growth as a lawyer and trying to identify how can I best serve the organization with, how do I best serve my clients, how do I help build business, how do I build relationships so that I become a more instrumental part of the legal community, how I can better serve clients, and maybe even develop paying client relationships as well. So there's lots of reasons you all come here today trying to figure out, how do I grow as a lawyer? How do I grow my business? And what you have probably found, and certainly will find as you venture out into this, is that there is no one size fits all answer. Everybody develops relationships, whether it's friendships, business relationships, differently. Everybody's comfortable in a different environment. Some people are great at large cocktail parties. Some people are better at, one-on-one coffee or a lunch. And you've got to find what fits you best so that you're most comfortable. Because as lawyers that generate a lot of business understand, and I've been very blessed by generating really great relationships and really great business opportunities, is if people like you, they will send you work. And that's actually the secret sauce. We can talk about, what's the key to success or what's the key to building business. But at the very end of the day, if people like you, they will send you work. And that has been a fundamental part of how I've tried to grow our firm's business. We have been very blessed over the last 7 years, where we've been pure plaintiffs lawyers. We've generated more than $100 million in settlements and verdicts. And in the past 29 months, more than $50 million. And that isn't by mistake. That's by design. That's with intentional effort to spend time wisely, spend time with the right people that can both complement each other. I often tell people that if I refer a case to you, like we don't handle car accident cases. If I have a car accident case that comes to me, I send it to a colleague in my community, I'm giving them that case. I don't want a referral fee. I'm happy to pay referral fees for lawyers that send cases to us, but I don't want referral fees for work I sent to you. I want you to be able to benefit from that. I want you to enjoy the full benefit of the relationship and the fee. And that's one of the things we've done that's a little bit differently, because I want to see other lawyers grow. This profession's been wonderful to me, and I really want others to enjoy similar gains and similar benefits. So when we talk about marketing and meeting and advertising, certainly everybody knows about the billboard lawyers. Everybody knows how much money it costs to advertise on TV and billboards. And if you got the money to advertise, and that's part of your model, great. It's not part of our model. We don't advertise. I think the only advertising we do is on the Orange County Bar Association as part of our contribution to the bar. We have a one-page ad I put in the OCBA magazine, which I think now is all digital. It's just a way of kind of top of mind awareness of sorts. But most lawyers nowadays don't have the time or desire or money to sink it into advertising. Now, social media advertising is a lot less expensive, a little bit easier to do even on your own, but billboard TV advertising probably is not going to be what you're interested in. Instead, what you're going to be looking for, I think, is how do you meet people? How do you meet the right people? How do you spend time wisely? So when we look back at networking, everybody remembers the traditional networking, and that's you get invited to a cocktail hour or a seminar or some event, and everyone's handing out business cards. And then you come back and you look in your coat pocket and you got a big old stack of business cards. And the question is, well, what do I do with it? Well, now a lot of people don't even have business cards. So that traditional networking is gone. People say, well, what's your number? I'll text you. Or what's your email? Or what's your website address? We're going to talk about ways that you can use technology to kind of advance your efforts to be a little bit more effective in what people call networking. I don't really love the word networking. I like the word relationship building. So we're going to talk a lot about that, but let's kind of reflect on where we've been recently. The pandemic radically changed everything. When our firm transitioned to being pure plaintiffs lawyers, we had about a 2 or 3 years of hitting the ground running, and then the pandemic hit. And then it changed everyone's efforts and opportunities. How are you going to build a relationship over a Zoom? So one of the things we were doing is I was having Zoom coffee hours. So what I would actually do is I would send somebody along with a link to a get-together, maybe an hour coffee at 8 in the morning. I'll also send them either an Uber Eats gift card, $10, or a Starbucks gift card and say, look, grab a coffee and let's chat. It's just some little step in the right direction to building a rapport, building a relationship. Nobody else was doing that back then when it started, but it was a kind of a new way to invite people in when the environment was so different. When we're talking to people like we are today, instead of what we're now starting to see as in-person events and in-person opportunities. But it did radically change the way we think. And it really caused her to take pause, take stock, and figure out how am I going to develop meaningful relationships online over Zoom, let alone how we're going to do it in person. So when we think about where we've been with the pandemic and where we go next, you're probably saying to yourself, but how am I going to do this if it's something you've never done before or never done consistently? And what we learn, and this is a scene, I won't play the audio, but there's a movie called Taken with Liam Neeson. He was a retired assassin that had worked for the US government, but his daughter got kidnapped. And then in this famous scene, he's talking to the kidnappers. And he essentially says to them, look, I've been a man that's had vast experience dealing with terrorists and people like you. And he says, I have developed a particular set of skills. It's kind of a haunting scene. And he says, look, if you let my daughter go, then that's it. But if you don't, I'm going to search you out and I'm going to get you. But the point of the scene really is he did indeed have a particular set of skills that helped save his daughter. And everybody here, whether you truly appreciate it or not, has a particular set of skills. And you may not know it. and you may not realize it until you kind of step outside your comfort zone and realize, I actually do something a little bit better in terms of talking to people, in terms of how you listen to people, in terms of people finding your outside interest to be particularly engaging and find your personality to be engaging. You almost got to be vulnerable enough to let yourself go and be open to new experiences. And I'm going to give you a few ideas today as to how to do that. How do you step outside the comfort zone and realize that building personal relationships is fundamentally important to your success as a businessman, businesswoman, and lawyer? Because as we think about our livelihood, we're not just practicing law. We actually are in business. And you have to find ways, in my view, to build your business, build your brand, build your opportunities. And it really starts with a grassroots approach to meeting people and to stepping out and doing more. So, what's essential? What are the essential tools? Well, if you look at some of the data, the statistics out there, the ABA has a website, a marketing tech report every year. It's available online. You have to pay for the one currently, which is stupid. You can look at the one back in 2021 for some of the trends, but I've looked at the 2023 tech report, and it's got some very interesting information. And just as an example, we all use these, our smartphones. They're called smartphones, not because they make you smarter, but you're really smart if you use it. Because 80% of lawyers use iPhones. Now, I'm sure some of you all have Androids and Samsungs, and those are great devices. It really doesn't really matter which one you have. The question is, are you using it purposefully? Are you using it in a way that will really enhance your engagement with other lawyers? Because I was just out of town in Chicago for a couple of days for business. And while I've got iPads and I've got laptops and all this other tech, I certainly use this more than anything, whether it's emails, whether it's drafting, whether it's reviewing, whether it's editing. If you have not become efficient in how you use your phone, start there. I've probably purchased more than 400 apps for phones and iPads, but there's probably about 10 that are worth a hoot. And if you send me an email at the very beginning, I bought a website years ago called richardlawyer.com. It's like a central hub of all my contact information. So you can type in my firm's website, hpslegal.com, or just type in richardlawyer.com, hit the link, and I'll send you a 3 or 4 page listing of all the best hardware and apps that help you become more efficient and more effective with technology. I actually give a talk on that, but that's for a different day. But the tools that you use really start with the most available and handy device. So think about it. Years ago, people had fancy cameras, right, with large lenses. But then most folks realized, especially the phone manufacturers, people use what they have handy. I could take a picture quickly right now. I have to go find my digital DSLR camera to take a great picture. The lenses on these are almost as good in many respects as those fancy cameras. So you got to use what you have most available, most handy, what you have in your pocket that you know you're going to use. So that's the first step in hardware. So we're going to talk about how hardware and software, and then some tips I've got at the end, can really help you build business. So let's talk about why hardware is so important. Number one, think to yourself, what information? So this is the what. What information do you need to have access to? So on your phone, you need to have access to your contacts, your calendars, the contact database you have, or case management software that's available. You need to have a quick way to access that. And a phone, laptop, or iPad or other kind of tablet is where it starts. So that's the what. Then there's the where. Where do you keep this information? I'm a big believer that you want to have software that's somewhat agnostic to any device you have. What I mean by that is we in our firm have some fancier case management software, but we also use Outlook out of the Office 365, which means all of my contacts and all of my events are on my secretary's desktop, which I have a mirror image of on my desktop, which I have an exact mirror image of on my laptop, on my iPhone, on my iPad, on every other device that I have. So when one change is made to it, it exists everywhere else. So quick tip. So when I meet somebody whether it's for coffee or lunch or at a cocktail hour. I don't really love to gather business cards. If I do, it's only for a short period of time, because what I try to do when I leave an event is I take out my phone. I've got a dictation app on here. I brain dump. I dictate everything I learned about each person I met while it's fresh. Sometimes I made a little note on a business card, but I want to brain dump. And it goes into the contact notes section in Outlook. So the next time I meet Alexis, for example, I will pull up my contact information from her. I'll remember that she had a baby just about 14 months ago or so. I don't think I put in there yet the baby's name, but I will next time I talk to Alexis. But it's one way of having information that's current about the people you're meeting. So when you next meet with them, like I met with a gentleman for breakfast this morning, I looked up the information I had written down last time about him. I remember the name of his wife, his kids, where he went to college, where he grew up, the name of his firm, how long he's practicing, what his favorite hobbies are, so that the conversation was fluid. And it makes you even more engaged with the people you're meeting, So that's the what. Then we got the where. Let's talk about the how. How do you use this information? That was a good example as to how I use contact database information about people I meet. And then who helps you manage it? Do you do it all yourself? Do you have an assistant? Have you gone out and hired a virtual assistant? Have you hired a virtual personal assistant for X amount of dollars an hour that can help you manage your life and manage your contacts, manage your calendar? All of these are opportunities to use hardware that will help facilitate the building of relationships and networking. So then, we already talked a bit about why the smartphone is so important and how many lawyers use an iPhone. Again, use what you have, but understand what a critical part that is to how you're going to be meeting, greeting, and interacting with people. So let's talk about software for a second. We know that your desktop and laptop are going to have some type of software program. It might just be a calendar. It might be something more sophisticated. It might be this CRM type of software for case management and relationship management. Every person, every office is different. If you're in a public sector setting, you might be required to use certain software, but hopefully you're allowed to carry some of the necessary relationship building information about your contacts with you wherever you go. If not, ask for permission. Some places won't let you do it unless they know that you have security in place on your phone. Dedicate to change your password every week. Dedicate to keeping information private. You want to be able to have this stuff readily available. There's lots of software. There's reminder lists. If you have an iPhone, there's an Apple Reminders app that's robust with the ability to keep track of different things and different people and different events. And there's task lists, and there's lots of ways to use follow-up reminders and notifications. You need to, though, spend some time with the software and learn how to do it. I love tech. Everybody who knows me understands that legal technology is something that I kind of have a special niche for. And I've learned a lot about it on my own. I taught myself. I read a lot about it, and I learned how to do it. And once you kind of get into the groove, you realize how helpful these little pieces of technology, hardware and software, can be to relationship building. So let's talk about how are we going to apply the available hardware and software to building relationships. Why is this important for relationship building? Well, let's first talk about a few myths, because what do you need to do to build relationships? Well, some folks are reluctant or resistant because they have this understanding in their mind, these myths in their mind that are a mental block. They say, well, I got to know everybody to start really building business. I don't really want to just look at a long list of names and figure out what to do with it. Or maybe if I can develop a long list of names, maybe that's the key to success. It's not. A long list of names doesn't mean you're going to be successful. It's what you're going to do with it that's going to have an impact on your success. Some folks think networking just takes too much time. It's not worth it. I had that impression for years. I was so busy working on the work. I wasn't working on me and the business and the relationships. If you've got to make the idea of building business the most important part of your career, because it truly is ultimately that when you get to your 30th year after 3 decades of practicing law, I wish I knew now what I knew then. Sounds like a corny saying, but it's true. You might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm not any good at it, or I'm just too shy, or maybe it's not that important, or I'm too busy. Trust me, you're not too busy to work on your business. Because the truth is, here's the keys to success. in my view, for a relationship. Be genuine, be yourself. I learned after the first trial I lost how important it was to be genuine, be yourself. I tell the story to folks. I've been married twice. My first wife was at my first closing argument, which was my first big medical malpractice case I was defending, and I lost it. And I remember leaving the courthouse really just distraught and feeling horrible. And I went home hoping for some comfort from my bride. And she looked at me and said, can I tell you what I thought? And she goes to me, she says, who was that person there? Because the person I saw talk to the jury, it wasn't you. You were trying to be a little bit of lots of lawyers you know and respect. A little bit of this guy, a little bit of that guy, a little bit of what you saw on TV, a little bit of this. You just need to be you, be genuine, because people like you. And if people like you, they'll believe you. And I now think of that, now married almost 20 years to my current wife with 2 kids, how valuable that advice was. That if you are genuine in your efforts to build business, just like if you're genuine in front of a jury, you will indeed be successful in building relationships. But the follow-up's critical. I'll give you a few ideas about that in a minute. You have to be consistent and disciplined in your effort to meet with people. I must be out of this office at least 3 times a week. There's a mandate in my office. If I'm not out of this office at least 3 times a week, someone's doing something wrong. It might be a coffee, it might be a breakfast, it might be a lunch, it might be a quick drink after. Although usually I'm so quickly trying to get home to family and kids and those responsibilities. I focus more on coffees in the morning. There's usually a good start time and end time. Maybe it's 7:30 to 9, 8 to 9:30 like it was this morning. But you've got to be consistent and disciplined and make that a priority. And it's the quality over quantity. You're going to learn that just throwing a bunch of names on your calendar and meeting with anybody isn't really going to get you anywhere. You need to meet with people who are like-minded and that also have a similar interest in building business relationships. It's okay to meet with people. Everybody knows why you're there. Now, I want to get to know you better, learn more about your business. What can I do to help you build your business? What can I do for you? That should be the mindset. What can you do for the other person? Because that will naturally evolve into what they're going to want to do for you. And if you're lucky enough to find connectors, that can really be an even quicker way to building better relationships. What's connector? Keith Ferrazzi is one of my famous authors. There's a book I'll show you in a minute about Never Eat Alone is the name of the book. And he describes that, you only have so many hours in the day. I tell my kids, there's 168 hours in every week. You have to go to school, you got to get to sleep. Then you have to find time to spend your time wisely. And if you can spend time with people who are connectors, that's the ideal relationship. So a connector is somebody who you say to yourself, well, I can spend time with 100 people, I guess. Or am I better off spending time with somebody who knows 100 people? That one person can connect me to their inventory of good connections, business people, lawyers, others in the community that can do something that will help build my network in a positive way. So if you can find people who are already connected in the community, those are really the sweet spot. I always tell people that I meet, my Rolodex is open. And the lawyer says, what's a Rolodex? Well, that used to be the paper file that had all of the contacts in your contact list. My contact list is open. If there's something I can do, because there's lots of areas of law that I don't practice in, but I know the best people that do. So I often serve the role as facilitating relationships, not really just what's in it for me. So what are the practical implications of technology? Because really, as a lawyer, you've got to strike a balance. Again, 168 hours in a week for you too. How much time do you have for in-person interaction? How much time do you really want to be spending online? Do you have anything people can look to learn more about you? Do you have a law firm? Do you have a personal landing page? What I mean by that is, again, I purchased richardlawyer.com. I read an article in the paper 15 years ago that said, buy your name followed by the word lawyer and pay the $9 a year, and that's your landing page. That's what I did. And that way, because people don't remember my last name, Schwamm, they may not remember my firm's website, hpslegal.com, but Richard Lawyer, pretty easy to remember. And that's where you can gather everything you need about me so you can reach out to me and learn more about me. There's also social media presence. Are you on social media? You don't have to use social media just to talk about, what your favorite food is or your favorite color or pictures of your dog. You can, or you can just use social media for business purposes like I do. And now everybody agrees video is king. People are taking videos of the dumbest stuff you've ever seen and getting thousands of views. Imagine if you took a video of something meaningful, like a lesson to be learned in the law, or what I'll start doing soon is some mentoring videos, very short in duration, but things that might help you think about a way to enhance your practice, enhance relationships, learn something new. People are engaged. That's why TikTok's so important. That's why YouTube is so popular. That's why people are doing more videos, because people want to watch more videos. Also, podcast appearances. Put yourself out there. Reach out to very well-known podcast creators who are looking for guests. Do you have a special skill, a special area of expertise where you can actually talk about it? Or webinar speaking engagements like this or others, or opportunities to put yourself in front of other people and build relationships, even with people like here that I've never met before. You can consider paying money for search engine optimization of your website, but it's pricey. You can consider paying for internet ads for your website or your landing page, but it's pricey. Or you can create some of these personal digital marketing tools, your own personal website, building upon your Facebook page, using things like a digital business card. So I've got a lot of business cards, but this is a hard business card. It's got my firm logo on the front, and on the back, it's got a QR code. So if I'm with somebody at a cocktail hour and they want my contact information, they take out their phone, and there's one of two ways I can get my information on their phone. Number one, take a picture of the QR code, or this has the technology. You hold it up to the person's phone on the back, and instantly there's a link that you press, and then you can download all of your contact information. My Facebook information, my LinkedIn contact information, my cell phone number, my Venmo, in case you want to pay me. So there's all of this information is available readily on this hard business card that I keep when I go. It's a good conversation piece. Not everybody's got it. Another one you can use, when I bought that, is from Mobilo, M-O-B-I-L-O. Mobilo card, is it came with a free little key fob. So if I don't have that card handy, I can hold this up to your phone, and it downloads all the contact information for me. It just popped up. Do you want to download Rich's contact information? Click a button, yes. It's now right in my contact. And now that's shared back to my secretary's desktop because it's all linked together. Okay, Chat GPT, that's the newest thing, right? Some of you might be saying, what the heck is Chat GPT? If you don't know what it is, Google it, learn more about it. It's a way of using the internet's tools and AI to build content. So there are some people that are now using AI that if you go to Chat GPT and say, create a one-page summary of why lawyers are so important in the public interest sector, and it will create a one-page summary. And you might want to alter it, tweak it, use it, and consider using it for your own social media, for your own outreach to others. There's lots of ways this can be used. There's lots of articles written about how this might help you with personal branding and marketing. And if you don't know much about it, learn. That way, next time you meet with somebody for the first time and you want to make an introduction and you want to talk about a new topic, talk about that. Because a lot of people don't really know much about that. So we've talked about the software, the hardware. We're talking about the implications, why it's important. Let's get to some practical tips. What are the top 10 tips to immediately impact your ability to build relationships? If you don't know who that person is, his name's David Letterman, who was very popular when I was younger. He's off the air now. If you actually see a picture of him now, he's got this big old bushy beard, and he does some things online where he still does some interviews of stars. And he had a late show, very popular. And at the very beginning, he would have Letterman's top 10, usually top 10 these stupid tips about lots of different areas. So I kind of just put up that there's just in case you're old enough to remember him. But these are the top 10 tips that, in my view, will immediately impact your ability to build better relationships and build your business and build your brand. So first, you need to spend the time to plan out your strategy. What I mean by that is maybe Saturday mornings at 7 in the morning, you're up before everybody else in the house, and you just have some moments of quiet. And you take out one of these journals that's got a blank page on it, start writing out, what do you want to do? Do you want to meet more people? Do you want to meet people in a certain sector of business? Do you want to meet certain lawyers? Do you want to just start writing down the names of all the lawyers that you've wanted to meet that you haven't met yet? And you say, boy, Rich, do you know who this guy is? Can you make an introduction? Reach out to me. If I know him, I'll make the introduction. Do you have a plan in mind as to how you can start to build a strategy of building better relationships? And if you don't have a plan, just start brain dumping or go online and read some articles. How do you build relationships? And it will help you generate some ideas. And you need to spend some quiet time planning. And if you're not willing to put in the time, then just turn off this webinar now, because it takes time to do this well and to do this right. And it's so critical to your success, in my view, that if you're prepared to spend the time, find those quiet moments, just you, Starbucks, on the couch, wherever you find that quiet place, commit to doing it and think about, what do I want to do to build upon to make myself even more successful? Second tip, number 9, read, listen, and learn from others. I often joke to people, after doing this for as long as I've done it, I say, look, if I don't have another individual creative idea and I just steal other people's ideas, that's okay. And I'm joking, obviously, but you really should be open to learning from others. And there are more opportunities to learn from others now than there's ever been. There's countless podcasts that give support to lawyers or business people or business development experts. And you can just listen to them when you're on a run or you're on your Peloton or you're driving on your way to work. There's no excuse for not spending time. Keith Ferrazzi's book, Never Eat Alone, I don't know if it's got an audio book yet. It probably does. If it does, it's a fabulous book. It just helps you generate ideas as to how you can help build upon your practice. And if you've never, ever thought about building relationships, there's no better time than now. And it is never too late. And you will be surprised with how quickly you can turn the idea of building relationships into actually developing meaningful relationship. It may not be overnight, but in less than 6 months, you can make huge strides to building your network of meaningful contacts and lawyers and other people in the community. But you need to read, listen, and learn from others and be open to doing that. Send a personal handwritten thank you note. Now, I have some personal stationery I use, and I go through ebbs and flows of this, just to be transparent. Ebbs and flows, being really good about sending a personal note after I meet somebody I've never met before. But if we go out for coffee and we've never met before and we have a nice interaction, when I come back, I spend a few minutes to jot a note. And the reason is it's something that people aren't used to getting in the mail. The mail, not just email, it's actually a letter that gets put in an envelope with a stamp, and we sometimes get to open them. And I don't know when the last time is you opened up mail at work. It's kind of nice to get a letter on your desk that you open up and see a note. And the note might just simply say here, like, thank you for attending the Orange County Bar Association CLE seminar that I put on. And the title of that seminar was Richard Schwamm is awesome. You should send all your referrals to him. I'm kidding, that wasn't the name of the seminar. But it was just an example of just jotting down a quick note, maybe something humorous, and then saying something like, I look forward to getting together again. In fact, I'm going to ask my legal assistant, Diana, to reach out to you in the next week, just so we can set up time, maybe in a month or two, to have lunch again. I really, really enjoyed hearing more about you and your wife and your upcoming trip. I'll look forward to seeing you then. Most people will want to spend time with you again if you follow up in a meaningful way. If you send a handwritten note, it's something memorable. So get some stationery, have it personalized, and be diligent and be consistent about sending out those notes. You also might want to send something to that person with the note. There's a speech given. It's called This is Water by David Foster Wallace. I think it was a commencement address. He gave it at a college. It might have been Loyola. But it's really a really, really great commencement address. It's meaningful. It tells a life story. So it was actually put into a book. It's about 25 pages long. I bought about 20 copies of this book. And when I reach out to people with a handwritten note, I oftentimes will enclose the book. Hey, I thought you might find this an interesting read. I hope you enjoy it, and maybe you'll pass it along to somebody else. Or after you've met somebody, if you find out that they love cats, send them a T-shirt. I like cats and maybe 3 people. It's a little quirky, but I'll tell you what, people remember it. It shows that you've gone an extra step, and it shows that you're trying to build a personal connection. And that's the key, right? When you're talking to somebody, engaged with somebody, you need to develop a meaningful rapport with them and show a genuine interest in who they are. Because again, if people like you, they will send you work, or they will want to spend more time with you and build a meaningful relationship. So that's tip number 3, 10, 9, 8, 7, tip number 4. All right, let's go to tip number 6. These are in no particular order. You got to use your time wisely. We talked about how precious the time is. There's something called the Pareto principle. Probably heard it before, the 80-20 rule. And what it suggests in the context of building relationships and spending time and trying to build business is that 80% of your results can come from 20% of your effort, which means be concentrated, be focused. And if you're focused, you can actually have remarkable results from even a small amount of time spent. But you've got to spend your time wisely and purposefully and intentionally. And you got to put the time in. I don't ever expect somebody to send me a case or want to spend time with me just because they met me once. I've got to make the effort. I've got to take the initiative, not in an obnoxious way, but in a real way, in a genuine way. And I've met lots of people where I say, I'm glad I met them, but I'm never going to really have a good relationship with them. For one reason or another, it's just not where I should be spending my time. With no offense to them, I'll be gracious. I'll be kind every time I see them. But then there's the group of people that you really know you want to spend time with, because out of those few hours you have, they can be meaningful. It can be rewarding. It can go both ways. And those meaningful relationships, business relationships, especially the ones that can turn into meaningful personal relationships, are really what can provide you with an opportunity for good business and really a rewarding way of spending your professional life and your personal life. But you got to put the time in, because good relationships do indeed impact your success. Phone a friend. There was a show years ago called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And you would try to play this game show, and you had this lifeline. I don't know the answer to the question, but can I phone a friend? What I mean by that is, how do you stay in contact with people in a meaningful way and develop relationships, whether it's mentoring relationships? How do you stay close? Well, one way is the phone. So one of the things I do is I actually have a reminder come up every Thursday morning, and it says, have you reached out to at least 10 people this week? And sometimes the outreach is a phone call, just cold call. Hey, John, I was thinking about you. Or, I just saw this movie. I know you're a big fan of the Mission Impossible movies. I finally got around to watching it. Thank you for encouraging me to see it. It was really great. Something. Phone them and develop some connection, and then do it. Send a text message. Hey, Mike, I know your wife was sick last month. I just hope she's feeling better. I was thinking about you guys. Or, I know you just came back from that trip you've been so excited about for your 10th anniversary. How was it? A quick text. If you send 10 of those a week, meaningful, purposeful, you'll be surprised by the response. The response will be something like, Rich, thanks so much for reaching out. She's feeling much better. Or we had a great time on that trip. It reminds me we haven't seen each other. When can we get together again? I forward that text message to my assistant. I make sure a coffee or lunch gets set up, or a dinner with the wives, something that shows an intentional effort to spend time with people. Because those people who know lots of people will be thinking about you when a business opportunity. Let me talk to you about the +1 approach. Because you have so little time, you're starting to meet people and develop these relationships. The second, third, or fourth time you meet with them, why don't you bring up this idea? Hey, John, I know we're getting together for coffee. I have an idea. Why don't you bring somebody that I don't know, and I'll bring somebody you don't know? That way, when the 4 of us together, we'll have a chance to meet some new people. It lightens the load of the conversation responsibility, because you're meeting new people, introducing somebody else into the mix. They appreciate the fact that they're now meeting 3 people they may not know. It's a great way of building your network, and it doesn't require any more effort. It's the +1 approach, suggesting that everybody bring a friend or bring somebody else into the fold that will help enhance the relationship and the conversation. Number 3, we're almost done. Follow-up is critical, and it needs to be non-negotiable. If you're not going to bother to follow up, don't bother going there in the first place. You have to recognize that people will want to get to know you and get to trust you before they're going to send you work or want to spend more time with you at a business level. And you have the responsibility. It must be your responsibility for follow-up. And follow-up is not hard. Just keep a list, look at that list on a frequent basis, and say to yourself, have I done enough to appropriately follow up, not pester, but to appropriately follow up with that person to show that I am indeed interested in developing a meaningful relationship. So, talk about building your following. That doesn't really mean, how do I keep adding more people onto my Facebook? Because, oh, wow, on LinkedIn or Facebook, I have 500 friends. No, you don't. I've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of friends according to Facebook. I got about 20 people that are the most meaningful people in my life. And then I've got lots of other people that I'm building relationships with. It isn't 500. So what you're following is really depends upon your personality. Now, maybe you are a vibrant personality that puts a lot of stuff out there on the internet and lots of videos, and your following is all about building more people. And volume is going to matter. If so, more power to you if that's working. But your following might just be the people that you're consistently spending time with so that you can try to build your business, build your networking community, build your brand, and make your life and your career a bit more meaningful by bringing the people close to you into it. All right, number 1. And we talked about this earlier. It's about being genuine. So I put a picture of someone that you might know. His name is Gary Vaynerchuk. Now, he is a guy that used to be a wine guy. He kind of took over his dad's wine business, and then he developed his own internet presence in the wine business. And now he's developed VaynerMedia, the Vayner brand. And what he is he's a brand networking specialist. He speaks all over the world on how do you build your business? How do you build your brand? How do you build relationships? And he puts out a ton of free content. You can find him all over YouTube. He's also got a podcast. But be prepared. He is profane. If you cannot tolerate profanity, do not listen to this guy. But there's lots of other people out there that have a similar message. Michael Hyatt is very much of a faith-based guy, the complete opposite, I think, of Gary Vaynerchuk in terms of his type of messaging. Or the Tony Robbins or the Tim Ferrisses out there. There's lots of people out there, but find somebody you can connect with and listen and learn from. Because what he has done that I think is a valuable lesson we learned is avoid the what's in it for me mentality. Don't go out and be meeting with people where it's obvious that you're just there to try to build business for yourself. I spend a lot of time with people asking questions about the person I'm spending time with. Oftentimes, by the time we're done, they know very little about me, but they've had a chance to share, and they have felt it as a rewarding opportunity, and that's okay. The next time you meet, you can introduce a few little bits and pieces about who you are, and that helps build a meaningful relationship. It's kind of like dating. You got to be a good listener, and you got to be genuine. You got to put the work in. You have to do it intentionally. So whether it's Gary Vaynerchuk or somebody else out there, be genuine in your efforts. Be yourself, allow your personality to shine, and find your niche, find what it is that makes you a little bit different, your particular set of skills. And what you'll learn is by building your network and your relationships in that fashion, I promise you, this isn't just a bunch of shtick. I've got nothing to gain other than helping you learn how to build your connections and build your network in a meaningful way. If you are genuine and purposeful, I promise you, you will build meaningful relationships that can make a big difference in your career. So if you have any questions, I'm an open book. I often tell people I'm happy to answer them, but I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with you and speak to you about this incredibly important topic about networking and building relationships. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much for your time.
Thank you so much, Richard. That was amazing. When I think about networking, and I'm a pretty extroverted person, right? Like I'm talkative. I go out there.
No, no, it's not true.
Right? But I'm doing some things wrong, about being interested instead of being interesting, right? Like
Right.
that's tough for extroverts, right? Because we just want to talk ourselves. And then I think something learning from this too is just it takes work. So I think people come to the concept of networking and say, hey, some people have it, some people don't. I'm one of those people, I don't have it. So I'm not going to do it. And it's such a fallacy because even for the people that maybe have more social comfort, sure, maybe that lets them be more genuine in a situation, but that's not going to seal a deal.
Right. Well,
Um,
well, one of the things that people say to me is, well, how do I get started? All these are great ideas, we're all grandiose, but how do I really get started? So here's what I would do. So I would open up my contact list on Outlook, for example. I've got hundreds of people on there that don't need to be on there, but they're there because I haven't taken them off. And I take 3 sheets of paper. The first sheet is called Tier 1. The second sheet is called Tier 2. The third sheet is called Tier 3. Tier 1 is who are the people I know, the people that I've already got a connection with, the people that I know I want to spend more time with, people I like, not just your family, but your friends, your colleagues. That's Tier 1. Those are people you're already connected to. Tier 2 is who do you want to meet? Who do you want to spend time with? Who in the community, whether it's on your list or somebody you met at a recent seminar? Tier 2 is your real meat and potatoes list, the list you're going to constantly go back to because those are the people you want to spend the most time with because you know ultimately that they can be the people that can really pay off for you and you can do something for them. And then Tier 3 is the wish list. Who are the people that might be on my list that I really haven't gotten to know better, or they're advertising lawyers that maybe I do want to build relationships with because maybe they can send me work that they don't want. And then write down all the names on those 3 lists and then say, okay, spend a little bit of time with the folks on Tier 1 because you already have the connection. You spend a ton of time with the people on Tier 2. I got this out of that Never Eat Alone book. Tier 2, that list. And then once every 3 months, go back and refresh your list. You might move people from one part of the list to another. The people that were on Tier 2, I now have gotten to know. I met with them 4 times, went with our wives, boom, they're in Tier 1. Do I need to add anybody else to any of the different lists? It's a way of getting started so you kind of know what the universe of people look like that you want to spend time with.
Yeah, and I like that too because, like you said, there will be some people need to see something. They need to see something concrete. So when you're moving people from the list, you can see the progress that you've made. So that would be something motivational for me.
That's right.
So, and folks, you have time to ask questions in the chat and the Q&A. In the meantime, I should have earlier introduced Jorge Acosta Palmer, who is here with us. Jorge is on this because the whole leaving a legal legacy is really his brainchild. So thank you, Jorge, for really bringing this to us and bringing the idea to us. Do you have any questions or anything along what Richard said or anything that was burning in your mind?
Well, yeah, I wish I would have had this like 5 or 10 years ago. I remember when I first started having a lot of experiences going to networking events and not even knowing where to start. And it's funny because you mentioned the business card, right? And I happen to have one of those. And sometimes I don't even know what to use as a conversation starter. And I see people exchanging cards and I'm like, you want to see something cool? And I pull this out. They're all like, ooh, I want to know what that is. And it's just a great opportunity to start the conversation. And so I was taking notes and some of the ideas of things that you were mentioning, but I was wondering if you had any other, because usually the getting it started, right? You mentioned that list, the contact list, but how do we get that contact list, right? How do we get it started? And I see Nancy mentioned here LinkedIn as a good place to start. That's a great comment. But any tips or ideas? I use sports. Sometimes I use clothing, like, oh, great sneakers. I use whatever I can find as a conversation starter, but any ideas that you can share that you would recommend would be great.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that because one thing I forgot to mention is when we transition from being defense lawyers to plaintiffs lawyers, I've already been out practicing more than 20 years. I had to think to myself, all right, this is going to be humbling. I think I've got a really good reputation as a lawyer, but I have not put myself out there because I've been chained to this darn desk working for the man for so long. I need now to figure out how do I build my business. And I started doing something that my partners thought was crazy. I opened up the Florida Bar News and the Orange County Bar News. and I looked at what lawyers were putting themselves out there, small and medium-sized firms that I did not know. And I started doing something that I vowed I'd never do. And I got into cold calling. Now, I didn't make phone calls. I actually drafted a letter that said, hey, I just saw your ad in the Orange County Bar Association. You do intellectual property law. I know nothing about that. Here's what I've done for years. Is there any chance we can get together? Let's have coffee. My partners laughed at me and said, that ain't going to work. And I'll tell you what, I had an 80% hit rate. 4 to 5 people said, absolutely, let's get together. And sometimes I didn't get a response. So I had my secretary call and say, hey, set up breakfast. Say, Richard reached out to you. Can we set up that breakfast? Sure. And I started meeting more and more people in volumes. The first 2 years when we transitioned, I gained 25 pounds. A whole lot of coffees and breakfast, right? My wife was very understanding that I was out eating myself into a business model. But it really helped me put myself out there. And then you start finding the people that are really like-minded. And then we started having small cocktail hours and purposely less than 20 people because I wanted to spend time in a meaningful way. So it started out grassroots. And then I went on LinkedIn, as Ms. Mendoza just mentioned. So I went on there and tried to find, maybe there are lawyers that I know I went to law school with. So I plugged in my law school class, found people that I haven't seen for years. And there are a bunch of lawyers practicing right here in Orlando or in Tampa. And I reconnected. High school classmates, local lawyers. I mean, I just spent hours trolling LinkedIn. It's kind of creepy if you think about it. But it really helped me build great connections and great relationships. Great example, there's a local family law lawyer here in Orlando. His name's Schwamm Wilcox. I never knew Cammie, but we have a last name that's strikingly similar. And I reached out and said, Cammie, I said, we have never met before, but I'm wondering, are we related? Because there are people in my family that spell it with one M. We got to get together. Cammie and I are great friends. And Cammie is a go-getter family law lawyer in the community here, and somebody I would not have met if I didn't step outside my comfort zone and just reach out. If you're not prepared to do that, then don't complain that you're not building relationships. You have got to take that first step. Last metaphor, there's an Indiana Jones movie, I forgot which one it was, where he gets to this part where it's like on a ledge and like he's going to fall into this pit. He has to throw some of this gold dust out there and it builds this bridge. And he has to have the guts to take a step. And that step is either going to lead to his death, he's going to plummet to his demise, or he's going to take a step and be on that pathway to get to the other side. You have got to take that step to get to the other side.
That's amazing advice. And I have another question that kind of is along the lines of what you just said at the end. You know, if you're not going to, follow up, or if you're not going to be comfortable, like, don't go. So what do you do if you're in a situation, you're trying to network, right? You're maybe not feeling that confident about it, but you're out there and you're trying, and like a connection's not going well. And it's not that it's bad. It's just you're realizing you're not being genuine. I sometimes have this problem because I am, a little bit of a talker, and I'm sometimes, face on the camera. I realize I'm like, hey, why'd you say that? That's not what you're really thinking. And you're getting into this point where you're like, I'm not being genuine. What do I do? Do you just disengage? Do you like leave? Like, what do you do?
You know what? There are some events you're going to go to that either the events suck, or you're just not feeling it, or you're not feeling well. And it's okay to say, you know what? It's just not the right day. It's not a failure. It's a recognition that we're human. And sometimes it's just not the right place. Or tell your friends to go and then get them there. It makes at least the entrance in there, and then have a deal. After 5 minutes, we're going to disperse like a big foot on a pile of ants. I'm not spending my time with you, but maybe together you say, do you see anybody here that you recognize? Let's get some momentum going. And they'll introduce you to somebody, and then somebody else will come over and join. And they have a small circle. And then even if you go to an event with 100 people and you meet 2, if those end up being meaningful relationships, that's success. It isn't a numbers game. It isn't out of 100 people, I met 34 people. Look at all these business growth, blah, 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 blah. And then they're going to find a place in your drawer, and they're never going to get looked at again. So if you go to an event and develop a meaningful interaction with 1 or 2 people, I think that's success. You don't need to put that much pressure on you. It is not a numbers game.
I was even going to take it a step further and say, if you're someone who is more of an introverted person and you need that practice getting out there, even if you come home and you don't have a contact, but you like successfully managed an event and you feel good about it and you're ready to step out again, I'd beg to say that's a success too.
And keep in mind, some people love cocktail hours or these larger events, and some people are one-on-one people.
Right.
I don't love large events. I don't really like to work the room. One of my partners, Pettis, is amazing at working the room. Former president of the Florida Bar. This guy loves an audience. And that's a compliment. He is fantastic engaging with numbers of people. I'd much rather develop a relationship one-on-one and build on that, or small group settings. You got to find what works for you, but you won't know what works for you until you just start to do it. You've got to start to do it.
Awesome. Well, we are rounding at 1 o'clock. Jorge, were there any other questions that were on your mind or anything else you wanted to bring up before we close out?
I just want to thank you, Richard. This was a great presentation. So thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to do it. Wish you all the best.
Awesome, everyone. Well, thank you for joining. As a reminder, this is part 2 of our Leaving a Legal Legacy series. Part 3, I don't have it up, but comes up, I believe, in May. I believe it's May 7th or May 8th. Either way, if you registered for this event, you are already registered for the next part. You're automatically registered for all the following parts, so you will receive that notification. Additionally, within about 24 hours after today, you will receive an email with a copy of this recording, information about the training series, and obviously my direct contact if you have any questions or anything you need. Richard, I am so lucky that I got to work with you again. Because you just keep doing such a great job, I might not say this is the last time. This might not be the last time I bother you. Thank you very much for your expertise, your kindness, and everything that you do.
Thanks, everybody. It really was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. See you at the next one.
Bye-bye, everybody.